Okay, so here we are at the Misinformation Speaker Series, co-sponsored by Northeastern University and Harvard University. Um, this, I realized while I was sitting there, is actually our 7th year. So we've been doing this for a while, which is cool that we're still going on and nobody has shut us down yet. We're really fortunate today to have Professor Lisa Fazio from Vanderbilt University joining us. Let me just say a little bit about her. She's an associate professor of psychology and human development, as I said, at Vanderbilt. Her research focuses on how the brain learns new information and why our minds are susceptible to misinformation and lies. Uh, her work answers questions such as how does the brain process information? How can we prevent the sharing of false information online? How do people learn simple facts and more complex knowledge, such as mathematical procedures? What can teachers and students do to improve learning within and outside the classroom? And a number of other questions. Um, she is a tremendously prolific scholar. I was scrolling through her CV earlier today and I stopped counting. It's something like 65 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. Uh, her work has been presented in dozens of locales. And today she's here to talk to us about misinformation. Why is it a problem and what can we do about it? So join me in welcoming Lisa Fazio.
No, thank you all. I'm super excited to be here and tell you about some of the research we've been doing in my lab and also the public reveal of our giant misinformation intervention mega study and what we found. So I'm going to start with a brief discussion of why it's a problem that we see false information. So we're all smart people. Why can't we just realize that things are false and then not have them affect our beliefs? And then we'll turn to kind of what can we do about it? How effective are the different interventions that we've held? We're going to start with a little public interaction. So I'm going to ask a question. You guys are going to just shout out the answer. So in the biblical story, what was Jonah swallowed by? Whale, big fish, different translations. Good job. How many animals of each kind did Moses bring on the ark? All right, most of you said 2. One person realized the error and said none. So you may have realized I said how many animals did Moses take on the ark? It's actually Noah who took the animals on the ark. Most of you who shouted out 2 know that it was Noah and not Moses who took the animals on the ark and yet didn't notice anything wrong with what I had said. So we call this the Moses illusion, and it's one of the reasons that misinformation is a problem. We often fail to use our relevant knowledge in situations, and we miss errors in what we read or hear. So in the original study, 80% of participants answered that question, despite being warned that some of the questions would be incorrect and even given an example. If you give people like lots of examples, a really strict warning, still about half of participants will answer that question with 2. We've been calling this knowledge neglect, where you have information stored in your head, but you're not using it in the moment. It's hard to connect what you're hearing or reading to what you already know. And if things are just good enough, you'll let it slide and you won't notice the error. And that makes sense. We weren't designed as fact checkers. Human communication is filled with lots of different errors in speech. And so as long as things are good enough, close enough, we keep going. So that's one reason that misinformation can be a problem. Second reason, in one of his radio addresses, Franklin Roosevelt once said that repetition does not transform a lie into a truth. And what my lab has been showing in the past few years is that he was wrong. Of course, repetition doesn't change the ground truth of a statement. It doesn't actually make false things true, but it can increase our perceived truth to statements. So when people hear something multiple times, they're more likely to think that it is true. And so we've now got almost 40 years of research suggesting that when we're judging the truth of statements, we rely on our prior knowledge, but also a bunch of other cues, like, have I heard this before? Is it familiar? And repetition. So I'll give you a brief overview of how we know these repetition effects happen, and that they happen in more naturalistic settings. So one of the things that's really shocking about what we call the illusory truth effect, or these effects of repetition on belief, is that they happen even when you should know better, even when you have relevant prior knowledge that contradicts what you're hearing. So among people who are able to tell you that the Cyclops is the one-eyed giant in Greek mythology, if they read this statement multiple times, that the Minotaur is the legendary one-eyed giant in Greek mythology, they think it's more likely to be true. They're more likely to judge it as true. They're more confident that it's true, different ways of measuring it. So how do we know this? Go walk through one representative study. In this study, we start with a knowledge check. So participants answer a bunch of multiple choice questions like, what's the name of the one-eyed giant in Greek mythology? Is it Cyclops, Minotaur, or I don't know? Answer a bunch of these questions. Then 2 weeks later, they return for a second session. They see a series of true and false trivia facts. Some of these are ones that they probably have some prior knowledge about. Others are ones that they probably don't know much about. And for each fact, they're just asked to rate, how interesting do you think this statement is? We have them do that just so that we know that they're processing each statement, not because there's anything particularly key about that rating. And then in the key phase, the truth phase, they see a series of trivia statements. Some of those are repeated from the exposure phase, and others they're seeing for the first time. So we can look at how true do they think statements are that they've seen before versus they're seeing for the first time in the study. And what that knowledge check allows us to do is split the statements into two categories. So there's the ones that you have prior knowledge. So you answered the question correctly 2 weeks ago. And then the ones that you don't have prior knowledge. So you either got it wrong or you said, I don't know. Now what I'm going to graph here is just the false statements. For the unknown statements, you get this typical illusory truth thing. So repeated statements are given higher truth ratings. This is a 1 to 6 scale. 1 is definitely false, 6 is definitely true. So you can see the repeated items on the right are given higher truth ratings than the new items on the left. But what we're really interested in is what happens with these known falsehoods. So these are things that contradict your prior knowledge, your existing knowledge, and you get the exact same thing. So people do rate these known falsehoods as less true. They do use their prior knowledge, but in addition to that, repetition is having an effect. And in fact, having a very similar effect for these known and unknown statements. So repetition is increasing your belief in statements even when they contradict your prior knowledge. Recently, we've been trying to see if this happens outside of laboratory settings, looking at both more naturalistic settings and larger numbers of repetitions. So in this study, what we did was take true and false, mostly unknown trivia statements, and actually sent them to participants as text messages. So they agreed that we could text them different things over the 2-week period. So every day they would get 5 text messages from us, and this served as the exposure phase. So they'd see the fact, and we asked to reply with how interested they were in that fact. The replies were just a way of us making sure that they were seeing and getting these text messages. Then on the 16th day, they were invited for this final survey where they saw a bunch of the statements and rated their truth. On that final survey, some of the statements were new, others they were seeing for the 2nd, 4th, 8th, or 16th time. So the things they saw 16 times, it was they'd seen it once per day, every day, up until the final test. So what's going to be graphed here is how many times they saw each statement, and then their mean truth rating for those statements. And what you can see is this kind of beautiful logarithmic pattern where initial repetitions are giving you a bigger boost than later repetitions, but we're still seeing small increases even from 8 to 16 repetitions. Just proof that it's logarithmic. If you graph it as the log of the number of views, you get nice straight lines. So even outside of lab contexts, repetition is still increasing belief, and it seems to do so in this logarithmic manner. We've also just finished collecting data of a study where we actually tried to do this on Instagram. So here, participants were asked to follow one of two lab accounts. We posted these different trivia facts 3 times a day across 2 weeks. We told them every time you see a post from us, please like it, just to kind of keep the algorithm showing them these posts and to see how many times they saw it. And we had 6 statements that were posted 7 times. Because of Instagram's algorithms, we don't know exactly how many times each person saw it, but 7 is more than 0. So they saw it more than 0 times over the 2 weeks. Then invite them into the lab, have them rate the truth of these statements, and we get a whopping effect again. Here it's bigger because it's 7 versus 1. So again, even when you're experiencing these statements in your real life, while you're distracted, while you're doing other things like browsing social media, it seems to be increasing the truth. I'm going to hold questions to the end just because I'm trying to pack a bunch of stuff in, but make a note. This happens not only with adults, it also happens with young children. So we've done a study with 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds, and adults. Here we have them listen so that there's no differences in reading ability. And we tell them that Ruby the robot's going to tell them some things. She knows a lot about some things and not a lot about other things. So some of the things she tells you will be true and some will be not true. And in the exposure phase, the kids and adults just say they're interesting or not interesting. And then during the truth phase, whether the statements are true or not true. In this paradigm with adults, so this is just the proportion of statements that they rate as true. You can see typical illusory truth effect for adults, exact same effect for 10-year-olds, and the effects even there for the 5-year-olds. So even 5-year-olds are already showing this effect, suggesting you don't really need much sophisticated metacognition or reflecting on your own experiences to be able to have this link between repetition and belief. As a fun aside, we varied the types of statements that we used in the study. Some even the preschoolers should have some knowledge of, some even the adults wouldn't have knowledge on. So you can look at what happens for the college students when we give them preschool level false facts. So these are things like a wasp is an insect that helps you make honey. A microscope can help you get a good look at the stars. And you still get an illusory truth effect here as well. So again, prior knowledge isn't protecting people against these effects of repetition. So some of the reasons why misinformation is a problem, it's hard for us to notice when things are false. Repetition increases our belief in statements, even when we should have prior knowledge that contradicts it. So the rest of the talk, what I want to talk about is what can we do about it? How can we increase people's ability to distinguish between true and false information online? And how can we reduce shares of false information? Before diving in, I want to reiterate that there is no one solution or perfect intervention. The study is not designed to kind of determine the king that is the only thing we should do. We think about these interventions in kind of the Swiss cheese model. Each one has unique strengths and weaknesses. If we layer a bunch of them, we might be able to solve the problem. So the goal is to kind of identify these different strengths and weaknesses and to do so in a standard experiment where all of the interventions are being tested on the same materials with the same participants. So right now, as a field, we know a bunch about a lot of different interventions, but they've been tested in different ways with different materials, different participants. And so the idea here is to compare a bunch of them on a level playing field. What we used as stimuli were true and headlines with kind of photos and statements. Some were medical, some were political. So half the statements were about medical topics, half of them were about political topics. These are both obviously false. The headlines, we had true headlines from reliable news organizations. False headlines were ones that had been fact-checked as false by fact-checking websites. And then the misleading headlines were things that were either mostly false or mixed on fact-checking websites, or things that used kind of misleading techniques like polarization, emotional manipulation, logical fallacies, things like that. So misleading is kind of this hodgepodge of stuff that's misleading but not 100% true or false. Half of our participants were tasked with judging the accuracy of the headline. So to your best of your knowledge, is the above headline correct? Definitely incorrect to definitely accurate. The other half were judged how likely they would be to share it. So if you saw this online, how likely would you be to share it? Very unlikely to very likely. To figure out which interventions to test and to design this study, we first gathered a diverse team of misinformation experts. So actually summer of 2021, through a mix of direct emails to researchers, snowball sampling, and emails to listservs, we gathered about 80 researchers from 12 different countries, all kind of leading experts in misinformation, but who champion different intervention approaches. So the participants range from kind of senior graduate students to distinguished chairs, come from 7 different academic fields, about 40% women. So we tried to pay attention to all aspects of diversity when getting this group. That fall, each member was asked to nominate 5 interventions that they thought should be tested in this mega study. So they had kind of an idea of how the design would be. What things do you think we should test? And there were 8 interventions that kind of clearly rose to the top. And those are the ones that we ended up testing. I will note there are some promising interventions that we weren't able to test because they just don't fit into this type of study. So things like lateral reading shows a lot of promise, but isn't easily tested in this type of study. I'll also say members of the group, we had a team lead for each intervention that designed exactly how that intervention should be implemented, a group that helped create the stimuli, a group that came up with the data analysis plan, and the whole team also approved the final design before we ran the study. So what was that design? So I'm going to walk through the control condition first, and then each of the interventions. So everyone started with some individual difference measures, primarily partisanship, political ideology, effective polarization, and then their social media digital literacy. Then they had round 1. So they saw 18 headlines, 6 false, 6 misleading, 6 true. Half of those were medical, half were political. And as they're going through that round, they're either rating the accuracy of the headlines or their sharing intentions. Then they had a brief filler task where they saw 8 of these neutral headlines with a little explanation. This is a kind of control for our debunking condition that I'll talk about later, but they just saw the headline and a little bit about that article. And then round 2, they re-rate the same 18 headlines from round 1, along with 6 new headlines, so 1 from each category. So we can see, do these interventions persist kind of 5 minutes later, and do they transfer to new things? Some of the interventions happened before round 1. So these were accuracy nudges, descriptive norms, inoculation, and media literacy tips. And I'll talk through what all of those are. Some of them happened as they went through round 1, kind of item by item basis, fact checking, source credibility, thinking mode, and warnings. For these, we always applied the intervention to 2/3 of the items. So of the 3 false things that were medical, 2 of them you would get the warning or the source credibility, and 1 you wouldn't. That allowed us to look at kind of bleed over effects. So fact checkers can't check everything. How does it affect the things that they can't get to? And then debunking occurred after round 1. but before round 2. So when I present the round 1 results, it'll be everything but debunking, and then the round 2 results include debunking. So these interventions work in different ways and target different things. So some of them are designed to kind of teach people skills, so media literacy tips or inoculation are designed to teach people about the techniques that people use to mislead, or what they should be looking out for when trying to notice if headlines are true or false. Others serve as kind of reminders that accuracy is important and that some of the things they see might be false. So accuracy nudges, descriptive norms, a bunch of the interventions serve this purpose. And then there's some that inform you about that specific headline. So this specific headline is false because of X, Y, or Z in fact checking or debunking, or this specific source is trustworthy or untrustworthy. So kind of informing people about the specifics. So we had participants were all US based and quota matched to the US population on age, gender, ethnicity, and region. We used Forthright Access to help us gather this data, and they were wonderful to work with, so highly recommend. We had 33,000 participants who finished round 1, and about 30,000 participants who finished round 2. That ends up being about 1,750 per condition in round 1, 1,600 per condition in round 2. And the analyses that I present when I do round 1, it'll be everyone who completed round 1. Round 2 analyses are just everyone who completed round 2. So I mentioned our control condition. Here you're just not given any special instructions, and all the analyses I'll report are relative to this control condition. So what happened in the intervention groups relative to that control. The analyses are linear regressions with two-way clustered standard errors on both participants and headlines. So I'm just going to go through the interventions in alphabetical order, one at a time, rapid fire at you. So first, accuracy nudge. So participants rated the accuracy of 9 neutral headlines before they went into round 1. So before entering round 1, just reminding them that like accuracy is something you should pay attention to and maybe think about as you're going through this task. So it happened after the initial instructions, but before the headline round 1, and it's serving as this reminder. No. Yes. I mean, it is in that they are rating accuracy, but no, we do not explicitly mention anything about accuracy other than their task during that is to judge the accuracy of the headlines. All right, so to orient you to the graph, so this is sharing. On the left is going to be round 1, on the right is going to be round 2. This black dot is discernment for false headlines. So this is the difference between true headlines and false headlines. So we want to make those different. That's one measure of discernment. Gray is for the misleading, so true versus misleading. What's the difference there? And then we've got participants' ratings for the true, misleading, and false items. So for all of the interventions, what you really want is for these discernment scores to be below 0, to be better than control. So we're trying to increase the difference between true and false, or between true and misleading. And then the error bars here are 95% confidence intervals. So not error bars, but you get it. So main thing, accuracy nudges are working. They're working really well. So for both false and misleading headlines, you're less likely to share misleading or false headlines when you've gotten these accuracy nudges. And that's true both immediately and after a little bit of a delay. So these aren't immediately wearing off. A few minutes later, you're still showing better discernment. Next is debunking. So this is after round 1, before round 2. You saw a fact check for the misleading and the false headlines. These fact checks look like this. So big label and a little bit of an explanation about why it was misleading or why it was false. So there is no data for round 1, but for round 2, it's again increasing discernment for both false and misleading. But one thing you should note is it's actually decreasing sharing for true things as well. So it's decreasing things for false and misleading more. It is increasing discernment, but part of what it's doing is just making you skeptical of everything. So people are just less likely to share things when they've been getting, after they've seen these debunks. This is the results for the accuracy. Note for the accuracy nudges, we didn't have them go through accuracy because rating accuracy is the intervention, and so it doesn't make sense to have them do the rating task, have the same as what the intervention is. But for debunking, it also is improving accuracy discernment, but doing it in the same way as the shares, where it's shifting you to be more skeptical of everything, just especially so of the false and misleading. Yeah, so everything in round 2 is without an intervention. Yep. Descriptive norms. Before they go through round 1, we tell them that the majority of Americans believe people should form beliefs based on evidence, think people should only share true information, will block people who share false information. It's kind of a nice paragraph that kind of explains that there is a descriptive norm in the US to share true information. And again, this kind of serves as this reminder of what people might want to be paying attention to. So descriptive norms significantly increase discernment on sharing for both false and misleading, and again, did so mostly by decreasing shares for false and misleading things. And that's true at round 1 and round 2. They also shifted accuracy, so increased accuracy discernment, although not by a ton. And at round 2, that's kind of borderline, especially for I think the misleading, it's no longer significant. So descriptive norms is having an effect, but fairly short-lived and not particularly strong. Fact checking. This is right before you saw a given headline that you would rate, you'd see a fact check. It's the exact same thing that we used for the debunk. So it looks like this. So you'd see this card about the claim, why it's false, and then you'd see the headline and be asked to rate either accuracy or sharing. This, again, works immediately, which you would hope it's like right before you're doing it. So it doesn't really affect sharing of true things, but does decrease sharing of false and misleading. A few minutes later, still effective, just not quite as strongly. For accuracy, it's also increasing discernment for false and misleading. Here it's doing it kind of in a similar way as the debunking, where it's making you more skeptical of everything, just especially skeptical of the misleading and false. And in fact, kind of a few minutes later, for the misleading headlines, you're now not quite as good. So that's no longer significant. And it's, again, just making you more skeptical of everything, but especially the misleading or false. For our inoculation intervention, participants just saw kind of 4 different slides that taught them about common misinformation tactics and features. So this is both teaching them things and reminding them. The cards look kind of like this. So exploiting your fears. This is one of the techniques that someone might use to try and manipulate you. You'd see an example headline and why that was misleading. So there was exploiting your fears, outrage manipulation, and kind of too strange to be true. So paying attention to plausibility. Those were the different techniques that people were taught about. It again works for sharing. It's not affecting the true information, but is decreasing shares of false and misleading, and does so both at round 1 and round 2. For accuracy, same pattern, which just decreasing accuracy ratings for the false and misleading, both at round 1 and round 2. Media literacy tips. So these provided tips for how people should kind of scrutinize information to assess its likely veracity. Happened before you went through round 1. Things like be skeptical, consider the source, consider the photos. So just things to look out for that might be signals for things being false or misleading. Media literacy tips worked really well in this context. And they're actually one of the few interventions that actually is kind of increasing sharing for true information while decreasing it for false and misleading, both round 1 and round 2. And actually for accuracy, significantly increasing people's accuracy ratings for the true information while decreasing it for the false and misleading, both immediately and after the short delay. So we were surprised by how well they worked in this situation. Past studies have found some benefits, but not this strong. Yeah. It's points on the scale. 6. Yeah. Not in this one. 100% sure. So they saw this slide with the first 4, and then they saw a second slide with the next 4, and then they moved on. They were held on the slide for both this and the inoculation. Everything that they had to read, we held them there for some minimum amount of time that was matched across all the interventions. I mean, so yes, this is not real life. All of these interventions were the strongest version of the intervention we could do, which was forcing them to sit there. I don't know if they were reading it or not, but they were forced to sit there for a minimum amount of time before they could move on. 1 to 6. Yep. Source credibility. So as they're going through round 1, they'd see little labels about how credible the source was. So they look like this. So low credibility source, kind of next to the source. So things were low credibility source, medium credibility source, or high credibility source. And we took those credibility ratings from Media Bias Fact Check that has checked a bunch of different domains. That source credibility again works, decreases sharing discernment, doesn't really affect true, but is decreasing it for misleading and false. Does so both immediately and a little bit later. For accuracy, source credibility is good for the false things. For misleading information, knowing the source doesn't help you that much. That's because some of the misleading things come from high credibility sources, some come from low, like they're just a more mixed bag. So source credibility isn't a really good signal for those misleading items as to whether or not they're true or false. So yeah, so both immediately and after the little bit of the delay, source credibility is helping you for the false items, but not so much for the misleading. Thinking mode, here participants were encouraged to kind of connect what they're seeing to their prior knowledge. So at each headline, we actually made them type out how do you know that this headline is true or false? So right before they gave a rating, they had to actually type out an answer to that question. Here, it again improved sharing discernment, did so by decreasing sharing of everything, but especially so for the misleading and false. This is interesting because it's actually not what we found in previous studies. There's one study that has found this pattern. We've got 2 studies that have shown that it doesn't affect true, but does affect misleading and false. So still a puzzle to try and figure out when it does or doesn't change your sharing intentions for the true headlines. But in this study, it reliably makes people less likely to share everything, but especially the misleading or false. For accuracy, it actually increases your accuracy ratings for the true headlines. So it's one of the few things that actually is boosting true rather than decreasing misleading and false, and does so both immediately and after a little bit of a delay. And then the last one is warnings. So here, as you're going through each headline, right before you would rate the headline, you'd see a warning. We implemented these similar to how Facebook does their warning labels. So blur out the headline a little bit, label that either said false information or misleading information, and checked by independent fact checkers. So you'd see this, and then you'd immediately see the headline and be asked to give your rating of it. Again, when you're rating it immediately after seeing the warning, it's useful, which is good. Round 2, it's still decreasing your sharing intentions here. But when you look at accuracy ratings, so round 1, working as intended, but round 2, no effects of warnings on discernment. So these warnings seem to be useful right in the moment, but even just a little bit of time later, people have forgotten which headlines got warned, which ones didn't. It's all just kind of a mix. So here's the summary of kind of just, did it work or not for various things. For sharing, everything worked for round 1 and round 2. Just is fairly easy to get people to be better at sharing the true things versus the false things. In terms of accuracy, almost everything worked immediately, and then after a delay, some things not as much, especially for those misleading headlines. Also in round 2, you can see that debunking was kind of more effective for misleading than fact-checking or warnings, suggesting that maybe the things happening after might be more effective than the things happening before. But that's also confounded a little bit by the delay between. So preliminary is there. As I mentioned, these interventions can work in different ways. So you can increase discernment by doing different things. You could increase ratings for the true things, making people more likely to share true or think the true is more accurate. You can just decrease their belief or sharing for the false and misleading. You can do both. Or you can decrease everything, but more so for the false and misleading. For sharing, almost all of the interventions are really just decreasing the false and misleading sharing. And then debunking, thinking mode, and warnings in round 2 are making people skeptical of everything, but especially the false and misleading. For accuracy, we find that making people type out, how do you know this is true or false, is increasing their accuracy ratings for the true headlines. Inoculation sorts credibility, and warnings are decreasing false. Media literacy tips is doing both. And then debunking and fact-checking, again, making people skeptical of everything, but especially so the false and misleading. You might also remember that we had these untreated items in round 1 and round 2 that kind of we didn't apply the intervention to. For sharing, even these untreated items, it improved discernment. So these informational labels are actually helping reduce sharing for all the items, not just the items that they're being treated. And to me, that suggests that part of the benefit of these labels is just alerting people again to kind of the importance of accuracy and that some of the stuff they might be seeing is false. Because even when the label wasn't applied to an item, it's still improving sharing discernment. And in terms of accuracy, you do end up with a bit of a bad thing for fact checking, where it actually decreased discernment for those false and misleading untreated items, partially by making people more skeptical of the true things. And then debunking, no, yeah. So that was the one possible thing. You should also know that there was some differential attrition across our different conditions. So this is the proportion of the participants who got to the end of round 1, given that they kind of got to the instructions. And so you can see that thinking mode, media literacy tips, inoculation, and fact checking all had higher dropouts than the other conditions. Thinking mode, it makes sense. We forced them to sit and type things out. That's really annoying. Inoculation and media literacy tips, they had to sit there on the screen reading them before we would let them move on. So we did some analyses to try and figure out if this differential attrition was causing some of the effects. So we actually recontacted all of the dropouts from the intervention conditions, had them go through the control condition, tried to get as many of them to do that as possible. For anyone who did come back, we just used that control data to fill in the missing data. And for the people who didn't return, we found kind of the most similar demographically dropout, filled it in with that, plus a little bit of a correction for the dropouts being worse at discernment than the returners. In any case, when we do all of that things that poor Mark, it took him months to do all of that, basically nothing changes. The 3 things that do thinking mode for accuracy is no longer significant in round 1, and descriptive norms for the false items. Yes. Yeah, but everything stays. Yes, to a degree. I've got it at the end that I can show. So huge thank you to Mark Sussman, who's the postdoc who's been leading the analyses for this project and doing a bunch of the wrangling of all of the various peoples involved. Big thank you to Dave and Steve, who are the co-PIs on this grant, and the entire rest of the team, along with the Mercury Project, who funded it. So quick conclusions. Repetition increases your perceived truth, even when the statement contradicts your prior knowledge, even in everyday settings. All of our interventions increase sharing discernment. Most also increased accuracy discernment, especially for the false headlines. But these interventions do seem to be working in different ways, especially for the accuracy. For sharing, it might just be that kind of reminding people of accuracy and that some of what they are seeing is false might be enough to improve sharing discernment. But for accuracy, there seem to be different results for different things. With that, I'll stop and happy to answer questions.
Okay, we're going to alternate between the Zoom and you folks here. If I could ask you to identify yourself before asking your question, and we'll just take hands. Okay.
Hi, Kai Kupferschmidt. I'm a science journalist at the KSJ program, looking at misinformation and disinformation for a year. So I just wanted to ask about the scale. I mean, one way of looking at this is that all of them worked a little bit, right?
Yep.
Another way of looking at it is that all of them worked a little bit, very little. So I'm just curious why you think, why is it so hard to have any more effect than that? And in the real world, I mean, these are ideal conditions, right? And I mean, you literally had the fact check of the exact news piece that was going to be there. I find it almost surprising that it has that little effect.
So part of why it's a smaller effect is for the false headlines, people are already decent at knowing they're false because they are kind of outlandish. So there's not a huge amount of space you can push people around, but there is still room to be better than where people are. Yeah.
Yeah. I just guess my question is: do you think that these kinds of effect sizes in the real world are enough to roll any of this out? I guess that's the question, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think these are clearly better than nothing. They are improving things. I think it matters what exactly your goals are in terms of changing people's beliefs versus what they're sharing and what you're trying to do. But I mean, small effects compounded across lots of items and lots of people can mean big reductions in misinformation.
I'm going to break the rules because I have a microphone in my hand. Do they stack up? I mean, if you introduce 2 or 3 or 4 interventions, does that increase?
It's a great question. We haven't tested it yet. There's Dave and Gord have done a study with Steve Landowski and Sandra Van den Linden where they combined kind of inoculation and accuracy nudges, and they do seem to benefit from each other, I think, if I remember correctly. But we haven't done much of how to implement lots of these together.
Okay, the first online question is about your illusory truth effect work. The question is, are there subjects who are resistant to repetition messages?
Yeah, so not consistently. So on any one measure, you'll find some people who don't show the repetition effect, but kind of if you have them do it again 2 weeks later, they're not consistently not doing it. We're still really interested in finding individual differences that predict how much repetition increases your belief. The studies that have come out so far don't really find any moderators there, but we're still trying to get there.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa, for a very interesting talk. My name is Adam Spitzig. I'm an MPA here at the Kennedy School. I guess I'm just curious about correlations between demographics and performance. Yeah.
Yeah, so what we find is that some things predict kind of accuracy and sharing discernment in the ways that you would suspect. So effective polarization, education, age all matter. We haven't found any interesting interactions between that and the interventions. We were interested in that, but so far in our analyses, we haven't seen kind of those interacting in any ways.
Okay, the second online question is, do political views affect believability of mis or disinformation?
Affect believability? Totally. So people will more likely to believe misinformation that conforms with their beliefs and their political ideology. For the repetition effects, it doesn't seem to matter though. So you end up with different baseline truth ratings for the new items, but repetition increases things equally for both.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much. Michelle Amazine from Boston University. Can you talk a little bit about the conceptual overlap between interventions, such as fact-checking and debunking, and then media literacy and inoculation, for example?
Yeah, so part of that overlap is kind of that difference between teaching, informing, and reminding. And we see that it's unclear, those teaching ones, if they're doing anything above and beyond just reminding people that some of what they'll see is false and that they should be kind of motivated by accuracy. I think it's I think hopefully they are doing more than that. I think that the media literacy tips actually increased truth, whereas it decreased false and misleading, suggests that media literacy tips is doing something more than just that. But yeah, I think that's some of my initial thoughts.
Okay, another online question is about whether there are differences in the political or scientific medical misinformation with accuracy or sharing.
Not really. Again, there may have been some baseline differences in sharing intentions or accuracy ratings, but we didn't see any interesting interactions between which interventions were useful for the medical or the political. Can you get a mic?
Hey, Lisa. David Lazar, Northeastern University. You had a lot of items here, and one interesting question is whether the size of the treatment effect was contingent on the item, because that also gets at the question of how seriously we should take the differences in the sizes. Like if we see the sizes, even if they're all the same size, a sign sort of vary, then that suggests that that we shouldn't take the difference in magnitudes too seriously.
Yeah, so there were 80 different headlines that we used kind of across all the different categories. And so each participant just saw kind of a random selection of that. So we're really interested in kind of if there are headline differences, but we haven't dug into kind of exactly where or what. So we're just kind of accounting for it with the clustered errors, but haven't dug in yet.
I'll circle back in a few months.
Yeah. And if you have specific hypotheses, we'd love to test them.
Okay, the next question is, in your opinion, what should the takeaways be here for American political journalism?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I think source credibility is an easy thing to add that seems to be beneficial. I think that it's important to remember that when people are online, they're motivated by lots of things, not just accuracy, and reminding them about accuracy can be useful. I think that fact checking and debunking are useful interventions, but I think we have all known this, they're not going to solve the problem. So I mean, for journalists themselves, there's only so much that you can be doing. But I think one thing I'll say about the repetition work is don't repeat false things unless you're making it very clear that it is false. So we know from debunking work that it's okay to repeat the false information if it's in the context of explaining exactly why it's wrong and why people shouldn't believe it. But if you're just throwing up a chyron with politician says X and no indication that that's true or false, bad, don't do it.
Sorry, one more. I'm curious if you've looked into a similar type of study with different media types, like videos or like different things like that.
Yeah, it's a good question. We have not so far. So all of this has just been on those little headline cards. With the repetition stuff, we're going to start looking at kind of memes and images and infographics and ways of visually representing misinformation and see if repetition affects it in the same way. But for the interventions, at least for this one, it was just those headlines.
Okay, the question is, if you'd done a study with a different population, for example, people from India or Germany or France instead of from the US, do you expect any differences?
Yeah, so there have been some studies that have compared cross-culturally, and in general, they tend to find that the interventions work across different cultures. There are differences, especially in terms of like polarization and things like that. But in general, most of these interventions seem to work cross-culturally. But there'll always be differences. for context. So like the media literacy tips would probably have to be specific for that country's context and the types of false information that you're seeing in that context.
Hi. I have two questions. I think they'll both be quick. One is, so you noted that it seems like a disproportionate number of people, or people are generally good at identifying the misinformation. And so one question is whether the interventions worked differently for people who were sharing lots of misinformation than for the rest of folks.
That is,
And that might seem like a good way to diagnose whether how the interventions work in different ways. So that's one. And then the second one is about the illusory, the repetition.
I answer the first
Sure,
before you
of
do
course.
the second.
Yeah.
It's a great question. Part of the issue is that it's different people doing control versus intervention. So we don't know how good they are at discernment outside of getting the intervention. So I'm not quite sure how to look at it, but I totally agree that it's a really interesting question.
Okay, cool. So the second one is whether, so it seems like if you're repeating this fact that sort of is matched on the semantic, like associative network, then you get the effect. But I'm curious about like if you swapped out Moses with the Noah's Ark thing for like Vishnu or even something that's not religious, if it would still show up.
Yeah. So if you ask people, so this was done in the 80s. So if you ask people how many animals of each kind did Reagan take on the ark, no one answers the question. So there are limits. And in other works we've done, kind of if people are talking about like the largest planet, they'll accept Jupiter or Saturn or even some of the other ones, but they won't accept Pluto. So there's totally limits of how plausible it has to be for you to not notice it.
There's a question on whether there's differences between repeating truthful information and misinformation.
Not really. So no. So we tend to get the same effect of repetition for both true and false information. Only difference is for stuff that people already really believe is true. Repetition doesn't increase it just because you can't measure the increase.
Hi, Lisa. I'm Nick. I'm a PhD candidate at Tufts. I was wondering, it seems like you have a lot of really interesting sort of subsequent data after taking all this thinking mode responses. I'm curious if you had the opportunity to analyze or cluster people's types of how are they thinking about this? What strategies are they using?
We're looking at it right now because yes, it is a huge amount of data. So from earlier studies, we've done some hand coding of like what type of explanation are they given and trying to look at if that predicts their decrease in sharing. We've currently got an undergrad who's trying to figure out ways of using either dictionary-based methods or machine learning methods to like code this giant set that we have. And so we're trying to figure out kind of the best way of doing that. But yes, definitely something we're interested in figuring out.
Okay, there's a question about from Brian Ball, who says, interesting findings. He's worried, though, that few of the interventions had positive effects on the true claims.
Yes.
So might variations of the intervention help? So, for example, adding claims to the, adding like, this has been fact-checked and found to be true labels.
Yeah, that's a great question. So all of our headline-specific things like warnings, fact checks, debunks, all were only for the false and misleading. We never did anything to confirm the true, except for kind of source credibility. This is a high credibility source. And you could easily think how that would help kind of increase belief in sharing of true information rather than just shifting down the false and misleading, which is what most of the interventions ended up doing.
Well, we've hit the hour, so I fear we must call it. So join me in thanking Lisa Fazio one more time. Okay, real quick before we adjourn, I just wanted to remind you of the two upcoming speakers that we have. Next week on the 14th at Northeastern, we have Katja Ogyanova from Rutgers. And then on April 24th here at HKS, we have Marty Hazelton from UCLA. Both of these will be hybrid, just as it was today. So thank you all for coming.